Thank you. Thank you for paying attention. I know there's a lot of interesting people here to talk to, so, but we want to cover a really important topic. Our guest today, Eric Topol, knows more about COVID, if you followed him on Twitter, than most people I know. And he looks both at the good and the bad of where we are. So let's start there, and hopefully we'll have time for questions, plenty of time for questions too. Eric, let's start with where are we today, and both the good and the bad of where we are, and what do you think people don't know?
Sure. Well, there's a lot we don't know. Any of us could know because this virus has been so unpredictable. But we're obviously in a lot better stead than we were at the beginning. The death rate, not just here, but around the world, is hit the lowest point since the very beginning of the pandemic, and it's still heading down. So we know from not just in vaccinations and boosters and prior infection immunity, we've been able to reduce the death toll. And that's great. The unfortunate thing is, even in this country, we've already had near 200,000 deaths in this calendar year. So when you look at it from the idea that it's not as fatal a condition, we're still staring at long COVID, a very important syndrome that still has not been demystified in many respects. And I think the biggest thing is that we're seeing virus versions that have increasing transmissibility. So we were went a whole year of 2020, where we didn't really see much evolution of the virus. There was a minor change from the ancestral strain to this D614G, and then all of a sudden it took off with Alpha, Delta, and then the big change, of course, was Omicron. The problem is that as opposed to the prior major variants, Alpha and Delta, Omicron has had these subvariants that are very troublesome. So it wasn't just BA1 and 1.1 that really hit this country. They had 50% more transmission than Delta. But now we have another 30% from BA2 that we're in the midst of. And tomorrow the CDC will announce that the whole country is now dominant with BA2, 121. I wish we had better names for these, And the problem is that's another 25% more transmissible. This transmissibility or contagiousness is indexed to more immune escape. So the virus is finding more and more ways to bypass our immune response. And that includes our vaccines. That's the biggest problem that we're not facing right now. There's this idea that with vaccination and boosters, we're good to go. And that, unfortunately, couldn't be further from the truth. We have the problem where our transmission prevention through the vaccines, even with 2 boosters, is weak. It's porous. The term leaky is probably appropriate. But moreover, we're no longer at 95% prevention of death and hospitalization. We're actually now hovering between 80, maximum 85 with 2 boosters. And it's not lasting as long. Instead of 4 to 6 months, it may be 3 to 4 months. So we're seeing chipping away at our immunity wall. And the other thing that we have to look forward to, supposedly, is this Omicron-specific booster. It's supposed to be ready in July. The problem with that is it's a BA1 booster. And we know that BA2 and BA2121 already have circumvented that. So that vaccine booster isn't going to have, likely, the impact that we'd like. So we're looking at a relatively sobering picture of where we're headed because the virus is still going to evolve.
So why has mutation accelerated? And is it mostly mutating in vaccinated or existing patients, people with antibodies to COVID? Why the acceleration, and why is it being more resistant?
Right. Well, the big acceleration, notably, was Omicron. That came because it had some 60 mutations, a really hyper-mutated version of the virus. It came, in many ways, as a a curveball in this pandemic, because while Alpha and Delta had limited mutations, it wasn't anything like Omicron. And when tracing that back, the most likely source was an immunocompromised person in Southern Africa who basically had accelerated evolution of the virus internally, and then that led to marked changes which infected other individuals, and then it just took off. The problem is, just in this country, we have 7 million like immunocompromised people, and there are tens of millions of those people throughout the world. And so any one of them could have accelerated evolution of the virus. The other problem, is we have other paths to get bad variants going forward. We have 28 species that the virus has become a resident in, and multiple spillovers, not just from mink. You may remember the Hong Kong BA2 wave, a horrible wave, was linked to pet hamsters that came into Hong Kong from the Netherlands. And then also we've had spillover from white-tailed deer. It's almost every white-tailed deer in this country is infected with the virus. So we have all these potential ways from animal reservoirs. And then moreover, we're seeing all these co-infections now, where people have Delta and Omicron, or Omicron BA1 and BA2, and that forms these recombinants, these hybrids. And so all these different ways, no less we have lack of containment. I mean, we have, right now in this country, we're averaging 110,000 new cases a day. And people are acting like...
That's 110,000 detected.
Detected.
I heard you write about a much higher number.
Yeah, a few days ago we had 200,000. That's more than 1 million, we know that. The multiplier is at least 5 to 10x. So we're averaging somewhere north of 500. In fact, we're well over the Alpha, Delta, the highest except for Omicron, and we're still going up. So we have this added, and by the way, Marin County, where we are right now, is 70 cases, new cases confirmed, detected per 100, which is pretty high. It's one of the highest in the country right now. So hopefully this won't be a super spreader event. You've done your best by having rapid testing and by having, optional masks. It would be better if we had all the tent open instead of making this into a restaurant. And my wife told me she'd kill me if I bring home COVID. How many people here have not had COVID yet that they know of? That's impressive. That is really damn impressive. Okay, because we're talking about at least 70% of adults, probably 80% have had COVID. And just in the Omicron, the first Omicron, BA1, 40% of Americans, at least up to 50% in 10 weeks got Omicron. So the fact that so many of you have been averting this, that's impressive. That's really impressive. But the question is, how can we do this as we don't contain this? The problem is our attitude now. We've given up. That's what the capitulation
Before we go there, you talked about 100 and some thousand detected cases, maybe 500,000 to 1 million real cases. What's the death rate today?
We're sitting around 300 deaths per day, which is still substantial, but obviously, a tenth of where we were, during the peak of the Omicron wave. So it's better, but, the toll of this, I think the notion is people have this idea that cases don't matter. But obviously, cases beget more cases and long COVID and hospitalization, and even with a lower rate of deaths. The problem is it's basically nurturing more variants. So unless we get the cases suppressed, and we have ways to do that, that's the good part. We have the means to do this, but we're not, we basically had this one-off Operation Warp Speed, and there's no willingness or will to have another really,
So how would you approach suppressing it?
Yeah, so there's 3 things that we could do that we like what we did for the vaccines, which were a momentous contribution. And I should say, as opposed to Bill earlier today at lunch, where he said that the mRNAs are slightly better than the other vaccines. Yeah, all the vaccines work, but there's a big gradient between Moderna, Pfizer, and, for example, the Sinovac and CoronaVac Chinese vaccines, and a lot of the others are in the middle. We're very lucky that we have had such highly effective vaccines. And by the way, they maintain that 95% protection from death and hospitalization all the way through the Delta wave with a booster. So what we can do is that Operation Warp Speed made a big difference. Remember, the average time for a successful vaccine is 9 to 10 years from the identity of the pathogen. This was 10 months. And that's successful. How about all the pathogens we still don't have a vaccine? HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, a long, long list. Epstein-Barr virus. So we should do that type of accelerated programs for 3 major things. One is a nasal vaccine, or if you prefer, oral vaccine. That's the absolute best way to block transmission. We should have had that last year. We knew transmission was an issue. It's just getting worse and worse. There are 3 nasal vaccines in late phase 3 trials now, but they should have been done. And all we need is 1 to hit. And to take a nasal spray every 4 months, that's not so bad. I mean, that can be sent in the mail. The second thing is we need a pan-beta coronavirus vaccine. That would take out the whole family, any variant in the future. We can do this. So around the world, and particularly in the US and at Scripps Research, we've got at least 30 broad neutralizing antibodies that take out any current or future variant. The problem is they have to be converted into a vaccine a multiplex vaccine that can induce 1 or multiple of these BNAbs. But we haven't gotten a company like a Moderna, Pfizer, J&J to adopt that, to go into a large-scale program. We need that. There's no incentive for them to do it. And then the third thing is there's so many great drugs that are as good or better than Paxlovid, but we're not giving them the priority. So if we go after those 3 things the way we should be, instead of capitulating, we can take control and get ahead of the virus rather than basically the attitude that it's over, we got to live with it. No, we don't have to live with it. And in fact, the vast majority of this group hasn't adopted that live with it because they've avoided infection, which is great.
By the way, we do have, and I believe the founder had to leave just a little while ago, we have a protease inhibitor in phase 2 trials for all SARS.
I talked to him, and that is a very promising small molecule. But that should have gone through that should have gotten government support and gone through the trials and be out there now. And it should be in everybody's medicine cabinet. So these are the things that we're not doing. And to be complacent and to have this attitude that the Congress, of course, is delusional.
Well, it's become hugely politicized.
Yes.
But what do you say to the people, and we can come back and talk about the politics, who say the pandemic is over or we have to live with it?
Yeah, we don't have to live with it. It's our choice. We have the resources to take control. These 3 things, each of them are doable. There's so much promise in each area. It doesn't mean they'll each be a smashing success, but there's multiple shots on goal, each of them. So all we have to do is put the resources in, and in order to do that, we have to have governmental support, and we have a real problem there. It's a deep lesion, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And to those who say this is just like the flu and you'll get over it, I want to lead into a discussion of long COVID because it's sort of one of my favorite topics around COVID. It's the principal reason I want to avoid COVID.
Yes, me too.
And I want to hide from COVID is long COVID. But talk about, is it like the flu?
Well, just to put it in perspective, the average seasonal flu, there's 30,000 deaths in the United States in a year. As I mentioned, we already have 200,000, and we're in May. So that's not what you call a seasonal flu story that we have here right now. And that's with vaccines that are far more effective. You know what, a flu vaccine is maybe 30, 40% efficacy. I mean, so we have and we have a Paxlovid, which has its issues with rebound, but nonetheless, it's very potent. We don't have a pill or a medication against flu. So we have better tools to work with this virus, but our outcomes are far worse than flu. This is nothing like flu. And the transition is, with influenza, we don't get every organ of the body affected or infected in many cases. So we're not dealing with things like myocarditis and central nervous system, and not just the syndrome of fatigue and lack of ability to exert oneself, but a much more serious matter. I mean, Bill Gates mentioned at lunch, there are some studies, of course, as you know, with the UK Biobank brain study, which is very worrisome with respect to...
Please describe that, because it's one of my favorite examples. This was a large group of patients who had MRIs of the brain prior to the COVID starting, the start of the pandemic, and then they did post-COVID infection. But describe the study.
Yeah, so the UK Biobank has been one of the most fertile resources for research that we have. As it turned out, they had done MRIs in thousands of people, and they brought them in, as many as they could, about 400, who didn't or did have COVID matched. And the people who had COVID, but were otherwise recovered, when they scanned their brains by MRI, high-quality MRI, they found that they lost gray matter, they had atrophy, and they did cognitive testing. It was somewhat rudimentary cognitive testing, but all these metrics were significantly worse than the people who matched control.
Yeah, it was stunning data. It's sort of, if you don't believe in long COVID, which we'll get to, it's still the principal reason I want to avoid shrinkage of brain matter in a fairly large percentage of the cases.
That's right.
I forget what the exact percentage was.
Well, it was a continuous, because it was basically shrinkage of white matter and the tendon atrophy. But the other thing, of course, it isn't just the brain. A very large cardiovascular study, and now replicated by others, has shown substantial after the 1 month, issues of clotting, stroke, heart attack, so all these cardiovascular problems, heart dysfunction. And then the other surprise that is just now confirmed by multiple studies, and it's disturbing, is the appearance of new type 2 diabetes that wasn't present at 1 month, but present at 1 year. So there's a lot of effects on organs that were not anticipated at the early times of the pandemic. We can't really wish these away. And there's going to be a study coming out Wednesday, an important study, by the same group that presented the cardiovascular, the major from the VA. We have thought that our vaccines protect from long COVID by about 50%. That's going to be a wake-up call, but this is the largest study yet, and it's nowhere near 50%. So we have this sense that our vaccines are going to protect us more than they are, and especially about long COVID.
So describe what long COVID is. I have a family member with MECFS that has many similarities, so I'm sort of deep into that part of the world. But for this audience, describe what long COVID is.
Well, it's a mosaic. And so some people, their predominant symptoms are they have a very fast heart rate when they even stand up or try to do anything, and they're tired. In fact, that's general across the board. But in one group, it could be that and shortness of breath with exercise. But the other group, the big of the clusters, have more immune-mediated type symptoms. They have joint aches, muscle aches. They have brain fog, in addition to these other symptoms. We don't really have the basis of this. We have no treatment that's effective. The only hope was that vaccines could prevent it. A study came out last week. The effect of giving a vaccine to someone with long COVID is very modest for improvement. So right now, we're looking at probably, depending on when you make the cutoff, 6 months or 1 year, somewhere in the high single digits to low double digit frequency of this syndrome. And I have colleagues who I work with who were athletes, who can't even go a couple of blocks, who got COVID back in April 2020.
And whether you got long COVID or not, is it dependent on the intensity of the infection or not? Speak to that.
Yeah, this is a really important point, because 75% of the people who have long COVID had mild to moderate infections. They never were close to being in the hospital. 75%. So yes, if you had severe COVID, you're in the hospital, you're in the ICU, there is a higher chance. But if you look at the proportion of people who get long COVID, it's by and large people, they had mild infections, they got through it, and then weeks later, these symptoms cropped up. And whether it's persistent virus, which has been identified in many studies, for example, through small bowel biopsies or other biopsies, whether it's autoimmunity, because there have been autoantibodies demonstrated in many studies, or whether it's just persistent remnants of the virus that are stimulating this immune, for that group, the dysautonomia of the fast heart rate that can be really troubling with the lack of exercise ability, we don't really have a good explanation for that either. It's a very puzzling, but it's like chronic fatigue syndrome, but amped up into millions of people. And as you know, we have multi-specialty clinics throughout the country now that have tried to serve these people because they have so many systems that are involved. They can't just be dealt with by a family doctor or a general internist.
Yeah, it's very hard to know. I've found most primary care physicians are not equipped to deal with long COVID or even how to approach it. And in fact, many of the recommendations, if you do analogies to ME/CFS, are actually wrong, like they're harmful. I do want to open it up to questions. So anybody who has questions, raise your hand. Ooh, lots of hands went up. Let's go over there. Mary Lou?
Hi, thanks, Eric. In the patient that will see you now, you wrote that visits to the doctor will be as foreign as going to the video store. And with COVID in the last 2 years, that should have accelerated, and you haven't spoken about it. Have we made progress there?
Yeah, I mean, there's more democratization of healthcare and medicine, but it's not made the jump I think we'd like to see. People still don't really have their data. They have just little pieces or access to portals. And they're trying to get information about their situation. And it's hard because there's so much now misinformation and even disinformation. So we've made very minimal progress, particularly in these last couple of years. We did see the whole movement to telehealth go through rapid progression. That is good. In fact, it took a pandemic for that to happen. And by the way, since you mentioned it, there are some really bright spots besides the fact that we finally validated that telehealth has a place. And that is this platform of the mRNA nanoparticles. It's apart from the patient side, but it is going to have perhaps more impact in the years ahead in medicine than any of us would have realized. We already are seeing the effects, not just in various infectious disease programs for vaccines, but cancer vaccines, ability to not just use genome editing for high cholesterol, one shot to keep the LDL cholesterol below 50 for a lifetime. No less, eye diseases and various blood disorders, including even engineering T cells to repair the heart, prevent scarring, things that we thought were unimaginable. So the fact that this platform, and by the way, that's with the rudimentary nanoparticles we have today. Mm-hmm. They can be engineered so much better to not lose the mRNA before they get to the cells, to get into the cells better. I mean, there's so many ways right now that nanoparticles are going through, another major jump. So we are going to see some great treatments and preventions we've never seen before because of the pandemic.
Other questions? Yes, Steve?
Hi, very, very interesting. We're extremely proud. We actually enrolled the first patient in the world on the Paxlovid study. But it's extremely difficult to enroll because you need it within 5 days of infection. And so Bill talked earlier about he tests himself every day, but of course he's a relatively wealthy individual.
Relatively.
And governments around the world have stopped the testing regimes, which I'd love your view on stopping testing regimes and having it in your medicine cabinet as you discussed, because that's the only way it works.
Right. So Well, there has been a study for Paxlovid, as you know, as a preventive. It didn't work. So, but we do need medicines that will be preventive like that, pills. We just don't have one. Maybe there's one in the works. But the Paxlovid, I think, is really interesting because, but by the way, I don't understand how Bill can say he didn't have COVID. It's like saying you're a little pregnant. I mean, he had COVID. Come on. I mean, what a joke. Too bad he left already. All right, so Paxlovid is, I think, interesting because you take it right away. That may not be the best thing because you squash any immune response. Remember, in the trials, there was a almost 90% benefit within 3 days. It extended even out to 5 days, the trial that you did. So the question we have now is we have at least 20 to 30% are having relapse after 5 days. They become infectious again, their symptoms come back. Typically, it's not quite as bad, but sometimes as bad or worse than the first bout. And the question is, you know, the people in that trial, they did not get it in the first hour. They had to go through a clinical trial. And maybe that was better, because if you have the beginning of your immune system kick in, you get some hybrid immunity. And so right now, we don't know how to deal with this rebound. Should we give 10 days? Should we tell people to wait till they have some symptoms? You know, everyone wants to treat early, but the question is how early? And what is this rebound really about? Remember that when the trials were done, it was in Delta. Omicron results in a much higher viral load. And that may just be the difference. That it's not about mutations that cause resistance to the Mpro in the drug, but rather just that this is a different virus in so many respects.
Question over there.
Thanks.
I'm going to make it, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So is there agreement on what long COVID is and the causes of it, and are there tests that are under development to diagnose it?
Well, there's an agreement, interestingly, from the UK. The UK has been far ahead of the US on this. They started talking to patients, going back to Mary Lou's point, right away, to have convened meetings, tell us about your symptoms. We have not developed a consensus statement in this country, but theirs is quite good. So there is a consensus for diagnosis and a timeline and all that. But the problem is, right now we're in elegant bird watching. We have no treatment. We have no etiology defined. All we have is the mosaic of symptoms described and a consensus on that. So that's the problem.
And as far as I can tell, we are not nowhere near close to a biomarker or a test.
No,
No, we are not even remotely close.
unfortunately.
Yeah. I have a couple more questions I want to ask, and I'll look out for hands if others have questions. Shrikant, go ahead before I ask my questions.
Eric, we've been seeing these waves, wave 1 and wave 2. I was in India with the Delta wave, and you were talking about transmissibility, that Omicron is much more transmissible, and Delta was more virulent, killed a lot of people in India. Now, I could see that going up, and you can understand that because it's spreading, but why does it come down?
Yeah.
I mean, I could never figure it out,
Right.
because the behavior hasn't changed, and
Yes.
and unless we hit herd immunity, where some 70% of us got it, which didn't seem the case.
No,
Even if you took a 10x on the numbers that we had. So, what do you think is going on when it starts coming down?
Yeah, so that's a really important question. First point, just to underscore, there's a notion that the virus will get less and less virulent over time, and that couldn't be further from the truth, because as you mentioned, Delta was far more virulent than Alpha or its preceding strains. And so we could see easily a more virulent one. The second thing is, why does it come down? Oftentimes as fast as it went up. We don't really know, to be honest. There's lots of theories about that. Basically, can it just find as many hosts and repeat hosts as it can, and then it just basically extinguishes its run, like a wildfire? That's one of the leading theories, but there's no good answer for this. And it isn't seasonality. I mean, you can throw a lot of different hypotheses, but no one has really provided a solid explanation. So it's an enigma. And it's just like the mystery of the virus, because there are many different mysteries about it that we still don't fully understand. Long COVID and that one are probably top of the list.
So I have a follow-on question to that. Obviously, the virus has evolved and accelerated in evolving. But there's sort of an expectation out there that as it evolves to be more contagious, it also gets less virulent. But I saw some papers on why that's not necessarily the case.
Right.
So tell us, is it necessary it'll become less dangerous, or is it possible we'll get the transmissibility of Omicron with the virulence of Delta or even worse?
Yeah, so this is tricky because we already saw it go in both at once. When we went from Alpha to Delta, it got much more contagious and more virulent. We could see that again. The problem, the confounding feature is we have so many more people immunized and infected now. So that's what happened when Omicron first appeared in southern Africa. It was thought, well, this is mild. But then when we saw it in Hong Kong with no prior infection and poor vaccination, particularly in the people of advanced age, it just was a killer. So we have a difficulty discerning the virulence because of so much prior exposure. We'll probably never get, even with all the infection and immunity we have, we'll probably never get back to time zero of the pandemic. But it may chip away further at our immunity wall, and that's the concern. You know, to have 95% drop down to 80%, that's a big jump in number of people who are going to wind up in the hospital. And that's where we are right now. What if it drops down to 60 or 50% effectiveness? That could happen. And that would be part of that, it has more virulence because we've lost our defense.
And the last thing I want to ask you is a statement from you, I think I saw, that said the CDC was delusional.
Yeah.
We like very direct talk here. Tell me what you mean and what would you do different?
Yeah, so I don't know if you look at the CDC website, but they have had for many weeks now, throughout the Omicron wave, as we could have anticipated, what you call the field of greens, or Peter Hotez, my friend, calls the field of greens. And basically what that is it has the community virus level. And so it has another map that they don't show, you have to go hunt for, which is the transmission level, which is very high. And that would show you where we are right here in Marin. It's 70 per 100 at the moment, which is pretty high. I mean, Puerto Rico is about 130, 140. So basically the CDC has been part of this feeding us the myth that the pandemic is we're over, we're in good shape, we can live with it. That just is not true. And unfortunately, as you very well know, there's been many missteps by our CDC. And unfortunately, they haven't done what we'd hoped them to do, which is prevent and control this disease.
Well, thank you very much. We should get on to food.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.